Today I'm going to share a little presentation I did for a class last year. It's about how birds swim in the water, and I hope it can offer insight into evolutionary limitations organisms face when adapting to lifestyles that involve varied environments simultaneously. This presentation is about aquatic birds, so first some background on what that actually means. We can call birds aquatic if they feed on the surface of it, that it being the water, or if they dive into the water to get food. We're going to focus on the birds that are actually going underwater here. Aquatic birds can have a variety of means of locomotion. In addition to walking, most birds that aren't penguins can fly. Birds can also swim on the water's surface like you might see ducks doing, or dive and swim underwater like loons or penguins. When diving and swimming underwater, birds don't all swim the same way. Some use only their forelimbs, some their hind limbs, and some both. We're going to focus on birds that swim with their forelimbs, i.e. wings. Flying is very hard, and meeting the requirements for flight comes to define much of the morphology of flying birds. Understanding the forces at play can help in understanding the stringent requirements. Birds tend to be aerodynamic to reduce their drag. Flapping the wings generates the lift and thrust needed for flight. The big challenge when flying is getting enough lift to overcome gravity. For this reason, flying birds need very strong downstrokes to push against gravity, while in a sense the upstroke really serves to just bring the wing up, preparing for the next downstroke. In contrast, when swimming with the forelimbs, getting lift isn't the main concern because the bird's buoyancy naturally carries it up. For this reason, both the upstroke and downstroke are useful in swimming because they are both able to generate forward thrust, which is made particularly important in water, whose greater viscosity relative to air means more drag to overcome. Since penguins don't fly, they are not restricted by the stringent adaptations needed for flight and are instead specialized for swimming. They have larger and heavier bones than other birds and have lost special flight feathers found in other birds. They also have smaller wings, or if we want to call them flippers, we can do that, relative to their body size. I suspect that smaller flippers are favored for having less drag, important again in the viscous medium that is water. Penguins, which swim and do not fly, are clearly adapted for swimming. So here's a question. What about the birds that both swim and fly with their wings? Would you expect that they are some kind of halfway between penguins and non-swimming flyers in terms of their morphology and function? To answer this question, we will first look at mobility in the joints of the forelimb, that is, their range of motion. Each different graph here is for a different joint, and on each graph from left to right, we're going to look at the penguins on the left, non-diving flyers, which are just like normal birds, on the right, and alcids in the right middle, a group which includes puffins, and in which the birds can both swim and fly underwater, and use their wings for swimming underwater. Comparing penguins to non-swimmers, we see that penguins clearly have far less joint mobility. I think that this is probably most likely because drag forces on the wings are so much stronger underwater, which might favor sturdier, less mobile joints. Flying can also require very specific and controlled alterations to wing shape and position, a requirement that is gone for penguins and allows them to get away with less mobility, but I'll emphasize that more in a moment as we go on to compare musculature. But the point we take away here is that the birds that both fly and swim with their wings aren't a halfway between exclusive flyers and exclusive swimmers, at least in terms of joint mobility. The swimming and flying alcids sit comfortably with the other flying birds, while the penguins are often a phenotypic space entirely of their own. Does this separation continue when we compare musculature? Each of these plots shows the relative sizes of a different muscle across different groups of birds. In each plot, the first three groups are different types of flyers, while the rightmost is penguins, NF being for non-flyers. Panel A is for the pectoralis. Most birds have a huge pectoralis or chest muscle. It can account for as much as half of their muscle mass. This is to power the all-important downstroke we talked about in flying earlier. Compared to the three flying groups of birds, penguins have smaller pecs than some of the flying groups, but not to an extreme degree. This makes sense because while the pecs aren't needed for flight in penguins, the downstroke is still basically half the source of propulsion when swimming, so it's still useful to have juicy pecs as a swimmer. I'll direct your attention to panel E next. This compares the size of a little muscle in the back called the LDCR. In most birds, it is used to pull the wing up and back to fold it in when the bird perches. Comparing the penguins to the rest of the birds, it is considerably larger on average in the penguins. In the upper panel E, NF is again penguins, while in the lower panel E, WPD stands for wing-propelled divers, which includes penguins but also some birds that also swim with their forelimbs, in addition to flying, like the alcid taxon, again including the puffins. One study also found that while it is composed of slow-twitch muscle fibers in most birds, in at least one species of penguins the LDCR is all fast-twitch fibers. What could account for this difference in size and composition? Well, it has been suggested that in penguins, the LDCR takes on a novel role in pulling the wings up to power the important upstroke when swimming, which would account for its increased size and new, fast fiber composition. Lastly on this slide, let's look at panel F. This is the biceps brachii, which bends the elbow and turns the wrist. It is straight up missing in penguins. This is a repeated trend in many of the smaller and more distal muscles in the penguin forelimb, which have become vestigial and are reduced or even missing in penguin flippers, as they have less range of motion to control and largely only manipulate the joint proximally at the shoulder joint. And now for our last muscle of interest, we have the supracoracoideus. This is the upstroke muscle in all birds. Unsurprisingly, since powering the upstroke becomes more important in swimming, the supracoracoideus is clearly enlarged in penguins, whether we look at just the penguins through NF or wing-propelled divers in general, all of which obviously need a strong upstroke for swinging for their wings. And on the left here is a principal component analysis of all the different muscle sizes for each group. PCAs are something, well, frankly, I hope to learn more about in the next couple of years, but basically the idea is that it breaks down all of the different traits in a few different axes for traits that tend to vary together. Here, the horizontal axis is largely an inverse function of the massive muscles that play a role in elbow flexion, like the biceps, which you will recall had a mass of 0 in penguins. So, it makes sense that we see the groups including penguins, NF and WPD on their respective plots, separated out on this axis. The vertical axis is representative of proximal muscle mass, that is, musculature closer to the shoulder joint than the end of the arm. Penguins still use these proximal muscles for swimming, so I'm not surprised that there's no separation of the NF or WPD from the rest of the groups in this vertical axis. Penguins are morphologically distinct from birds that swim in the same manner as them but also fly, and those birds retain much more of their flyer phenotype in terms of joint mobility, as well as in some of their musculature, than the swimmer phenotype of penguins. This is the result of the stringent biomechanical requirements of flight. There is a narrow phenotypic space in which flight is viable, and to diverge from that means losing flight altogether. So, if you want to both swim and fly, you have to make concessions on the swimming side in order to retain your ability to fly. This raises the question of what the evolutionary intermediates looked like on the way to modern penguins, flightless and highly specialized for swimming as they are. Penguins diverged from the group of birds including petrels called the Procelariformes about 60 million years ago, and if I had to guess, I would say that the last common ancestor at this divergent probably looked more like a typical flying seabird than a flightless penguin. So, how did penguins make the leap to their modern, flightless lifestyle? Anyways, here's a little summary of what this presentation covered, and I leave you with a comparison of the forelimbs penguins against other animals that are secondarily aquatic, that is, animals whose ancestors were terrestrial but at some point returned to aquatic lifestyles.